Hi, good afternoon, and I know for some of you it's good morning. Thanks for joining this webinar where we're going to be discussing the topic of non-human traffic and bots in the retail industry. Just before we get started, I'd like to do a couple of introductions. My name's Tom, I head up product sales here at Technica. I've been here for getting on for over 5 to 6 years now, working with various different retailers around the globe, helping them protect their websites. We're very fortunate today to be joined by our CTO and co-founder, Andy Still. Andy Still heads up our product development team and has worked with a lot of the UK's major retailers such as ASOS, M&S and ShopDirect in the past. A wealth of experience in this industry and also a very published author as well in this space. I'm told his books are a little bit like a Harry Potter novel, just a little bit more DevOps, but certainly worth a read there. All available on the O'Reilly site, so a little plug for Andy there. But yes, before we just get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of background about, we're going to be showing you a lot of data today. How do we have this data? How do we collect it? Why is it of interest to us? So just as a quick sort of little bit of history, getting on for 3 years ago now, we developed what was and pretty much still is the world's leading queuing system. So it's a system capable of handling millions of hits at once, allowing retailers to deal with really sharp, sudden spikes in traffic, typically driven by TV, advertising campaigns or marketing. Effectively, what we saw getting on for 2 to 3 years ago now was we were sat in front of a large number of retail sites across the UK, US and Asia, and some in Europe. And a lot of our customers would say they had visibility of the traffic and they're expecting X amount of customers. And what we tended to find was the level of requests and the amount of traffic hitting our system in front of those systems was often much higher than what they expected it to be. We then did some further research and we started to realize that there was a real growth of effectively non-human traffic in this space. So a lot of the visitors that they're expecting to be hitting them that were humans, actually they're getting a lot more requests than really equate to that. So we very early on started to look in this, and we've recently launched a product called Bot Management, which is about giving you visibility and control over this. So just a little bit of a background into how we get this information, why we're interested, and some of the data we're going to be showing you. I just want to cover off a little bit of an agenda. So we expect today to talk, go through the content that we've got. It's going to take about 40 to 45 minutes. Important to note, at the end of the session, we will be doing a Q&A. So if anyone does have any questions at any point during today's session, please feel free to put them into the question box and we'll cover those off at the end in the Q&A session. Any question related to non-human traffic, bots, anything that you're seeing or anything that we're covering, we'd welcome as many questions as possible. In terms of what we're going to cover, I'm going to be doing a little bit of background. So this is background in terms of research we've done, some industry insights we have from working with some of the UK's and globe's sort of largest retailers. Before I pass on to Andy Still, Andy's going to be discussing the real problem space of non-human traffic, what that non-human traffic is, before going through some exclusive data and research we have from a number of sites from around the world, various different retailers in various different sectors, and essentially the impact of bots and what we've seen them doing to other retailer sites. There's some real insight for you there. Followed by a bit where we're going to cover off, Andy's going to discuss the solution. So not necessarily our solution, but the various options you have to potentially mitigate non-human traffic before we move on to that Q&A. So don't forget, any questions at any point, do feel free to put them into the question box. We will cover them at the end. I wanted to just start effectively, we're trying to set a bit of a scene here, a bit of research into why we've seen the retail industry change so much and why we've seen it rise with non-human traffic. In the early 90s, we did see the real revolution of online websites, the first transactions. Once we moved through that sort of 90s period, we started to see the rise of the disruptors. That was the launches of the price comparison sites, Google, PayPal, Amazon and eBay, and then as we move further forward, we start to see a real change. So these were disruptors that didn't really change the way that people look at purchasing. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, that really changed the way people engage with brands, view products, and look for things, and the way they're influenced. So we saw a real change in effectively all of this stuff affecting the traffic. Not really a bigger change than the iPhone, effectively the biggest change that we've seen. So back in 2007, when the iPhone was launched, it was always predicted that people should start working towards mobile first. And then in 2016, we actually started to see mobile take the lead as the #1 channel for e-commerce, the most sales being done through the mobile channel. So we've seen a real big change in the way from not having websites effectively, getting on to the early 90s to now people shopping through mobile, being influenced by social media, and also we're starting to see a real rise of the Internet of Things. So things like the Amazon Echo allowing people to purchase through voice command, and also a real big game changer as well, Google product search, now known as Google Shopping, launching, really changing the way consumers look, search for and shop for products. So real big changes going on in the industry, and that was just sort of a real general sort of look. At a deep dive level, some of the stuff we've been coming across and encountering as we work with a lot of retailers really is the rise of the price scraper industry. So we didn't really want to show too many brands here or name and shame any sort of brands, because they are offering a valued service for a lot of retailers. But there really is a large growth in the amount of businesses offering people the ability to scrape website pricing, scrape website data, scrape products, SKUs, track inventory, track sales, and really give them that competitor edge in terms of understanding what the competitors are up to, and potentially how they can beat them, and things like pricing and what products are hot. Some of these people offering near real-time price data, so a lot of services out there now for people to buy, and we're very certain this is a big and growing industry. It doesn't take long to do a quick search on Google, and you will see these numerous bits of software as a service, and managed services, tools out there for people to enable them to get this data intelligence. And a lot of these are actually paying for paid search advertising. So we know that this is a business that's not going away, certainly one that's growing, and certainly one that people are putting and making money in. So I think it's also interesting to note the rise of the price scraping freelancer. I think this is really interesting. I was just looking at this last night, so this is really as hot as it can be. All of these adverts posted within the last 7 days, very different ones, but people really openly looking on job sites for people and freelancers to do some form of price scraping, create some form of price scraping algorithm for them. If we look at just the various different ones, I think this gives a little bit of insight into the problem space we're seeing on the retail sites. The very first advert effectively wants someone to track the most popular products on a certain site. We blank that out. We're just there. But if one thing I would recommend everyone does is, if they are concerned about people doing things, have a look, Google your brand name, search if people are great at scraping bots, and the software that references being able to scrape your prices, well worth a look. But yeah, effectively the first advert here is looking for someone to track, what items are most popular, what's selling out fastest, what's selling, what's going on sale. The second advert, really interesting, different type of scraping here. This is where someone has asked for someone to completely scrape one of the UK's major sites, and effectively it wants to scrape the whole site, every single page, every single product, including the price, the SKUs, the imagery, and the actual description. So that's a really targeted attack on scraping on a really major retailer there. And then the final one, a different sort of angle at this again. This is someone just wanting to scrape between 10 to 200 different websites. So they're looking more at the general sort of comparison. But we certainly can be confident, that this is going on. As I've said, the real change in the internet, the rise of Google Shopping, the price comparison engines has really driven a sort of importance around pricing. And it's something we've seen in the press as well more recently in later years. Now that there's a lot of engines out there that allow people to scrape pricing, there's also a lot of things that allow people to track pricing. And this is something we've started to see more recently with particularly deal days like Black Friday being referenced in the press, where the press are going out using these tools and looking at historically, are the offers actually what the offers say they are? Is it a discount? So we're seeing a lot of retailers actually been burned in the past few years through these scrapers, through the press, as customers are getting upset about prices and offers not essentially being what they appear to be. This is sort of layering out again the importance of pricing and differentiation. Obviously we can see, you've got very clear, obviously Google Shopping's an interesting one, and everyone sort of being involved in that is clearly interested in pricing their product, service and delivery. You've then got obviously things like Price Runner, My Supermarket. But more interestingly, we started to see some major retail players actually referencing their competitors' price on their own site to show that they're cheaper. Effectively, you come to purchase from us and you can be confident that we're cheaper than anyone else. Here's their prices. So really sort of taking an aggressive stance on pricing there, and one that we only sort of expect to continue, the importance of pricing in the sector. I think a little bit of a subsector here. I know there's certainly some people, some businesses that have been targeted by this sort of thing before on today's webinar. If you are someone that essentially sells a really high demand product, the obvious common one here is sneakers, special edition trainers, Kanye West, special edition cosmetics. We are seeing a real rise in bots of people trying to purchase these with automated shopping bots. We've actually seen a real rise in these, and it's not just in the sneaker industry, it is in the cosmetics, but effectively a lot of retail sites that have very niche products that go to a niche market with limited quantities are seeing these things sell out in really quick times because a lot of their customers are using automated mechanisms to purchase. And then sadly enough, we are seeing a lot of people then resell those products and create effectively a business of it. There's been various articles out there, really interesting reads about some young people making significant amounts of money through purchasing limited edition products using price scraper, sort of automated shopping software to purchase them and then reselling them. And obviously, the impact on the customer there is certainly not a good one. If they've come to your shop to buy it, they can't buy it, and then they see it straight up for sale on eBay at 10 times the cost. It's really not good for the consumer. So we're seeing a real rise in the shop bots that people are using to potentially grab hold of limited edition products and make effectively an industry out of it. So really interested in there, certainly something that's going on, certainly something for people with niche products to be aware of. Then, not everything I'm going to talk about is negative, but we certainly have seen a real rise in the amount of account takeover. There was a really interesting study by Shake Security where they were speculating that around 90% of all login traffic was actually potentially through some form of account takeover attempt. So really interesting study by them, but effectively what we are seeing as more and more data breaches come out, as cyber criminals are finding it easier and easier to purchase people's details, obviously then we're seeing a real rise in sort of your typical account takeover, brute force, dictionary and stuffing attacks on sites, and this is something really difficult for retailers, I would say, because we've written a really interesting piece on the website if anyone wants a free handbook on this, but effectively the average sort of UK consumer has about 118 different accounts today, and effectively 70% of these pretty much use the same password, so effectively your site can be compromised by the lack of security on one of their other accounts, and we are seeing a real growth in that. So certainly one to watch out for. I suspect a lot of people may be the victim of account takeover attempts, and certainly one we're working with a lot of people on. Obviously everything I mentioned, a little bit grey, certainly some negative stuff in there. There is a real rise in also good bot traffic though as well. So we're talking today about the rise of non-human traffic, and it's certainly not all bad. There's a lot of good stuff going on. We're seeing a lot of retailers really leverage the value of third parties and referrals, getting a lot of their traffic through referrals. We're seeing the rise of IoT devices like Alexa and Dash that can enable sort of automatic purchasing, so automated sort of journeys of the typical human shopping. Really interesting as well, H&M, we're seeing the sort of conversational commerce start to launch and get wider. So this is retailers actually using chatbots on channels like WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram to actually communicate with people and actually encourage them to purchase and get them to purchase through those channels. We've seen really interesting comparison sites launch as people are looking for deals. And finally, the channels, the social media channels we started to discuss earlier on, are opening up and allowing people to buy directly in the channel. We've seen Facebook open up their sort of payment services and really going down that route, so we expect to see a real rise in the amount of people being able to purchase through your store but actually on other platforms. And I think there's a real question as to whether that is actually part automation of the shopping journey. Is that a bot hit? Is it a human hit? Certainly one to be debated, but there is certainly a lot of good non-human traffic out there. All in all, though, effectively, I think what is safe to say is we are seeing a real rise of non-human traffic in the space. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass over to Andy, who's going to talk a little bit more specifically about what we're actually seeing, what this non-human traffic is doing, before we move on to showing you some actual data that we've collated from various different e-commerce sites around the globe.
Thanks, Tom. So Tom's given us a pretty good background to what's going on within this particular industry, so I thought it was worth at this point just giving a bit background about generally what we mean by when we talk about non-human traffic or when we talk about bots. And I think essentially non-human traffic is any traffic that is not directly triggered by human action. It could be an automated process, as we can see from the word cloud here. There is a wide variety of different activities that are being undertaken, and both positive and negative. Say there is definitely good and bad in non-human traffic. The bad is fairly obvious. You've got hackers out there trying to crack systems, exploit vulnerabilities, take over accounts. You've got content theft. You've got ad fraud. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got your search engine, spiders, Google bots, and the such like. You've got your monitoring tools and generally things, SEO management tools and things that would be regarded as positive. I think sometimes it's a bit simplistic to say it's just good and bad traffic. There is definitely a grey area in the middle. Things like Tom's just been looking at about price scraping. That could be good, could be bad, depending on the requirements of your particular business. Will vary from industry to industry as well. And then you've got content harvesting. That could be positive, could be negative, depending on what the intentions are, the people behind it. I think it's also worth taking this to the next level and looking at, when we say non-human traffic, with all of it, there's a human involved somewhere. It's all triggered by a human in some respect, and that the level of that human input will vary a lot depending on how targeted the activity is that they're trying to do, whether it be good or bad. So the left here, where you've got very high human input, you've got the likes of Alexa, and Alexa, could be buying tickets, could be getting an insurance quote, it could be buying a product, it could be searching for where a product is available where a product's available from. There's all sorts of things that these very digital assistants will be doing a lot more of as time goes on, and those are very specific activities that are being almost directly by one human activity. At the opposite end of the scale, you've got your scanners, vulnerability scanners, or search engine bots, which are just scouring the internet, gathering content, looking for exploits that they can act upon. And there's very limited human direction in targeting that particular traffic. In the middle, you've got a wide range. So there will be some that fairly general price scraping, just looking at a full range of sites, looking at all their products, harvesting that data, and then bringing it back to use elsewhere. And then at the other end, you may have very targeted particular attacks, like the sort of sneaker bots that Tom was talking about earlier. They'd be quite hand crafted to meet us, focus on a certain particular product or site, and they would just be targeted at delivering that particular product. And as I say, they would typically have more human involvement, so they'd be more focused on that one particular aspect. So with all that, it can be very difficult to determine what you should be doing about this situation. And I think, as you said, there's this full range of non-human traffic, some good, some bad, some not so good. So it's important that you take some time to actually properly come up with a plan of how to mitigate this problem. We've come up with really a two-stage approach to this. The first stage really being an understanding phase. It's taking a step back, looking at the data you've got about this, and then really trying to understand what the activities and what the nature of this human traffic is, to determine a good understanding of what's going on and why this traffic is here and what it's trying to achieve. Only once you've gone through that analysis phase and you've got that depth of understanding, you can then start assessing that traffic and try and determine what you need to do to maximize the value that you're getting from that traffic, whilst also minimizing the impact that it's having on your system. And it's important to remember when you're doing that the same traffic can be delivering value and having negative impact, so you do need to weigh up the two of those relative to each other. So when you start looking at impact, what sorts of things should you be looking at? I mean, first and foremost, you would look at what the impact is on your other users. Is it negatively affecting the experience of your human users? And that could be related to the quality of service they're seeing. So, you know, that could be down to the availability of products. And the sneaker box are a good example of this. Are your actual human customers being unable to purchase what they want because of the activities of non-human traffic? You know, understand the impact of that has on your brand and your customer experience. Or it could be just down to performance. So there could be the overhead that's being created by non-human traffic is meaning the actual site performance is slow, affecting the experience of your other users. I think as a knock-on for that, you start thinking about what's the impact on your company interests. Is this non-human traffic? Is it using your site for purposes that you wouldn't think were in the best interest of the company? And this could be in terms of your brand or the public perception of you, or it could be in terms of actual business interests. You know, if this is making prices available to your competitors that allow them to undercut your pricing, therefore losing business, that's clearly not something that you would want it to do. I think the next one is probably some ways the most obvious one is to think about the impact on security. Is this making your system inherently more insecure? Is it putting you at risk from exploit or vulnerabilities either known or unknown that you've got on your system? And lastly, the impact it's having on your infrastructure. And this again could be around scalability. It could be that you start hitting limits of storage limits, database limits, licensing limits. It could be around performance. You know, you could be hitting the limits on your servers, so they actually can't serve traffic as fast as you would like to, or you know, even hitting performance limits on there. And it could be cost related, so you will be paying a lot more for bandwidth if that's how you pay for your bandwidth. You may be carrying more infrastructure, you may be having to pay for more licenses, all those sort of things. It's obviously a negative impact that you need to evaluate against the value that you're seeing from that traffic. Okay, so that's the kind of background to general non-human traffic, and you know, the context at which you need to look at it. And what's the impact on your system typically in this industry? And I think there's, as you said, there's a massive amount of different types of non-human traffic out there doing all different kinds of activities, and what we look at doing is largely trying to categorize that traffic, and from that we can try and sort of deduce what the impact and sort of generalize when we're looking at the value impact assessment that we were just talking about. And just as an example, we'll pick out one particular category of non-human traffic and go through in a bit more detail. As I say, for this industry there was a number that we could have picked, but we've picked price scrapers as a good example of non-human traffic that does affect quite a lot of people in this industry. Price scrapers is basically described as it could be any automated process that's gathering pricing information it could be for display, it could be for competitor analysis, it could be for resale on other sites, either with or without your consent. The OWASP, the Open Source Security Group, have identified a range of automated threats, and scraping is one of the ones that they identify in that as well. So what's the value or impact from that? I mean, the first one, looking at the value, this could result in sales, depending on what the scrapers are doing with it. If it's putting it on a price comparison site, it could result in traffic coming to your site, which could result in sales. So there's clearly a potential value in that. But what's the impact on that? And first, the impact on other users is obviously there's a performance impact while they're trying to use the site. And I think going on from that, in some of the price scraping ones, it could be affecting sort of prices that are available. But generally speaking, it's mainly around the impact of performance in this area. From a business interest point of view, competitive price matching is clearly something that can impact your business. If people can respond very quickly to your pricing and undercut, and then their prices are going up when things are unavailable on your site and they drop as soon as it's available on your site, that's clearly not in your interest. It's not what you'd want to do from a company point of view. You want to be confident in your pricing and maximising your margins on that. And then the other one is looking at this from a price comparison point of view. You've no control over how this is being represented on that price comparison site. It could be misrepresented, it could be unfairly or inaccurately compared to other prices. For example, it could include or not include shipping costs, which would misrepresent it, which means that when people come to your site to buy it, they're disappointed or dissatisfied. It will, from that point of view, is affecting your brand, potentially negatively, potentially positively. Again, this is a matter of weighing up the impact of that kind of problem. And from an infrastructure point of view, you're obviously handling a large amount of requests in an unstructured manner that you wouldn't otherwise have to have, so it will be impacting your infrastructure. Okay, I'd like to hand back over to Tom now to talk through some of the more kind of general business impacts.
Yeah, so before we get stuck into that deep dive, I just want to talk about some of the impacts that I guess non-human traffic is having on the businesses of our customers effectively. And obviously we've touched on it a lot, so I don't want to go into it too much further, but obviously competitive price scraping is a key one. Further to that, if we've got a large amount of traffic on a website which is actually never going to purchase anything, quite often we see that skewing quite dramatically people's analytics. Particularly in the e-commerce sector, when we're working with people, conversion rate and Google Analytics stacks are really key for them to really make some important business decisions. And if those are being skewed by traffic which you're never going to purchase, it's certainly something you should be trying to look to filter out. A further one, performance and infrastructure. Andy's touched on it quite a bit. We have seen some customers get some real gains from just knocking off the head some of this traffic that's actually never going to generate any sales, and enable them to actually either reduce their infrastructure spend or just free up their infrastructure for potentially bigger events and serving more of their actual customers or speeding up their delivery. Talked about account takeover earlier. Account takeover is a real biggie. Obviously, the impact of a customer's account being taken over can have a real impact on the reputation of a business. Not only that, it can potentially have financial implications, so certainly one to watch out for there. And I think the final one, a bit of a surprise one for us, we're also seeing, if you do have a lot of non-human traffic using your site not as intended, we do actually quite often see a lot of incidents and alerts and monitoring triggered by this, effectively waking up our support teams and getting to effectively try and support people who you actually don't want to be supporting at all. If anything, you potentially might want to be blocking them. So really there, yeah, a lot of different impacts, and potentially some of the people who really want to optimize their revenue generation through price scraping, there is also the option to optimize for non-human traffic as well. So if you are selling through third parties, repushing your price, selling on marketplaces, it could also be an argument not just to block or mitigate, but to actually optimize those channels as well. So really interesting. It's about, for us, working with every business on a case-by-case basis, but really, we'd recommend you try and understand the real impact non-human traffic is having on your site, and is it something you want, is it something you should optimize, or is it something you should actually seek to mitigate against. So I'll now pass back over to Andy, just to remind everyone we are doing a Q&A at the end, so if anyone does have any questions, please do get in touch. More than happy to answer at the end, so yeah, do feel free to fill in that question box at the side if you have any questions. I'm going to pass back to Andy now. He's going to be presenting some information, basically some data we've gathered on running some analysis for a number of different large e-commerce sites around the world, so different sectors, different countries, but essentially, a couple of different interesting problem spaces that we've seen out there in the e-commerce market. So we're going to go deep into that. I think one thing that is worth mentioning, Andy's going to touch on a lot of solutions out there, but I think it's important to stress that all of this data and all the non-human traffic we've spotted has actually already bypassed typical WAF and DDoS solutions that a lot of these retailers had in place. So, this is all stuff that we catch once you've got through your typical standard set of mitigations that we see on any site.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So yeah, as Tom said, there's a few different examples, hopefully to illustrate some of the problems we've been talking about today. And then the first example we did, which was gathering a week's worth of data from an e-commerce site, and we'll just assess that, and we'll drill down into this in a bit more detail. And I think first thing to do is just look at the split between what we identified as non-human traffic and what we identified as human traffic. And here we saw 42% of all requests were from what we would regard as non-human traffic, and that is fairly typical. That's probably an average that we would see. Certainly some significantly higher, some 80+%, and some significantly lower. But 40 is not an uncommon amount of traffic that we would see. And to drill down into this same data elsewhere at a kind of daily level is, you see in the graph on the left here is all traffic, and on the right here is just what we would regard as human traffic. So you can see on the left there's spikes, and it doesn't particularly follow any reasonable pattern. And it's clearly certainly some very big spikes in there, but it's fairly steady spikes coming at different points of each day. And when you relate that to the graph on the right, which follows a much more standard pattern that you'd expect for human usage following the sort of standard daily routine. So you can see from that clearly the non-human traffic is affecting the profile of traffic, which does make it very difficult to predict. And where this becomes more interesting is when we drill down to this next view of the data, which is where we started not looking at the number of requests, but the actual back-end processing time. So this is the impact on your servers, the amount of time they're actually spending processing these requests, which illustrates that, as you can see from the left, the overhead of serving the non-human traffic is dramatically more than that of the human traffic. So the human traffic in the graph on the right is in very little impact compared to that on the left. And the reason for this is that non-human traffic tends to make a lot of requests, but a lot of requests for high-cost areas of the site. So this is for search results, price inquiries, and things like that. That tend to be the more database and system-intensive parts of the site. And it doesn't do the other standard bits of the user journey that your human traffic is doing. So the more easily cached areas and things like that. So what we've done from that is taken that graph to drill down into a slightly different view of it, which is where to aggregate those totals across the entire time period. And as you can see here from the graph at the top, you've got all your traffic, which is in blue, and your human traffic, which is in red. And the top graph, which is the number of hits, relates back to the pie chart we saw at the start, which shows that close to 60% of traffic is human, which is interesting when you flip that to the bottom graph, which is the same red-blue, but is looking at back-end processing time, where as you can see at this point, human traffic is less than a third of all the processing time spent. So of all the infrastructure time that is being spent handling these requests over that period, only 1/3 is human traffic, even though close to 60% of the requests were human traffic. And where that becomes even more marked is when we take that same view, but for the peak hour. And as you can see from the bottom, the peak hour was 7 p.m. in the evening, so what you would regard as probably a busy time for human traffic. So this wasn't like this was a big non-human traffic spike which was taking place out of hours. This was during the peak time for human traffic. And you can see here, obviously, there's a large amount of the hits during that point were non-human traffic. But what is even more compelling is that 90+% of the back-end processing time during that peak hour was spent processing non-human traffic, and a very small amount was spent on human traffic. So to move on to a different view of the world, this is from an e-commerce site where we started looking at not all non-human traffic. We're just looking at just scraping traffic for this particular site. And as you can see here, the blue is all traffic and the red is scraping is scrapers. Sorry, the blue is humans and the red is scrapers here on this graph, which shows that for most days, the amount of hits that were associated with scrapers is pretty close to that for all traffic. And what's even more compelling when we start looking at this as just from bandwidth usage is that during that period, which was a month, over 20 terabytes of bandwidth was served just to scrapers. So that's not even to all non-human traffic, that is just to scrapers. So that is obviously, depending on how you manage your bandwidth costs, that could be quite a significant cost just serving scraping traffic. And this next graph, which I thought was an interesting one, just in that it gave a little bit of background to how the non-human traffic is working. This graph actually looks quite complicated, so it takes a little bit of explanation. And the way this works is that over this period, there has been a large number of IP addresses that have requested content from this particular system. And what we've done for each IP address is tracked how many different days that it requested content on. So for each of the dots going across, it represents how many different days. So the further up the graph the dot is, the more days that it has made that request. So the reason why we were doing this was really just to look to see if all this scraping traffic, was it coming from a fairly steady set of IP addresses, or were they varying? And what we can see from this graph is that the vast majority of this traffic, the vast majority of IP addresses we only saw on one day. We saw some on 2 or 3 days, but beyond that was very little. There's a very small amount that we saw using more than that, which just illustrates how regularly and how varied the source of the traffic that we were seeing was. And then lastly, another example, again, this is from a different site, where we started doing some analysis around how many account takeover attempts we were seeing. So on here, the blue is all traffic, and the red is traffic that we'd identified as a targeted account takeover. So that is people credential stuffing or making other attempts to try and bypass the account login. And I think we can see from here that throughout the period of this analysis, account takeovers were happening fairly consistently, and it's clearly a problem that needs dealing with, because the impact potentially on your business and on your other customers can be quite severe, particularly if you run a kind of bonus scheme that gaining access to those accounts can give you particular advantages. And here we see non-human users basically trying to access accounts to gain advantage of those sorts of activities at the expense of your legitimate users. Just as a sort of next stage to that, I think we were interested to see whether that account takeover, what the geographic distribution of that was, because I think a fairly obvious suggestion to that is that these account takeovers are all coming from certain countries that we don't really do business with, so we could just block them. And what we saw from that, so this was based on a US-based system, so we're seeing a lot of those attacks, the largest proportion of those were actually coming from within the United States, so clearly you couldn't take a geographic blocking approach to that. And the rest were from a wide range of countries, from Europe, Asia, the Middle East. So there was a very wide variety of different countries that we've seen there. So we were struggling to see that a geo-blocking approach would have had much impact on that. But this sort of data, sometimes that can be quite revealing. Sometimes you will see that all this contact is coming from a specific country, and you can just block access to that country if it's a country that you don't generally do any business with. And similarly, we looked at this to see whether there was data centers that we could block access to. As you can see from here, there are some large ones. I mean, the largest one is unknown traffic, which obviously you wouldn't want to be blocking. But some of the big ones, you've got Comcast, cable, you've got Time Warner cable. Clearly, you wouldn't want to be looking at blocking that. You would expect that would impact legitimate users as well. Okay, so just moving quickly on, there's some, I think, interesting real-world examples that we've seen in here, but what are the sort of solutions that are out there that we can be dealing with this? And I think before we go into solutions, it is worth just pointing out that it is a difficult problem this to deal with. There is no difference between human and non-human traffic by the time it hits your server. They are technically the same thing. It's a non-exact science to detect the difference. So how can you go about putting a mitigation in place? And the first one that we see fairly commonly is using static blocking, maybe on a firewall, maybe on a web application firewall. It could be a blacklist of IP addresses, a blacklist of user agents that you block access to. Now, the issue with that is, as we saw before, these IP addresses are constantly changing. So you do need to constantly be maintaining it, adding new ones, keeping on top of it. And more than that, you need to be bringing industry-wide sources of data in that to try and allow you to keep ahead of the crowd. This will have some impact. If you do both those things and you keep on top of it, you can block some. We see it as low as 1%. Sometimes we see it higher. It's certainly a useful tool as part of an overall approach. Next one is we see trying using cache content, so back to non-human traffic, just to lower the impact. Could be from CDN. I think the other thing is it depends on your system. If you've got real-time pricing, it's probably not feasible. You could try only serving this to non-human traffic. Again, there's a risk associated, as we said, there is revenue bearing non-human traffic that you would want the correct details to go out to. We did do a little bit of research into the impact of this on the data set that we looked at earlier, what impact caching would have had on this. This was quite an intensive search system where there was a wide variety of parameters to input to it. So caching only had a limited effect. You can see here from the red area. It would have had some effect, but it certainly wasn't a silver bullet. Another approach we see using is rate limiting. So basically reduce the amount of requests that can be made from a certain IP address, IP range, user agent, things like that. Again, this will have some impact, certainly have some positive impact in reducing scrapers. The risk is, are you damaging the activity of your revenue-bearing traffic from your legitimate known affiliates? And the other risk around this is that the bot operators will probably quickly adapt to your limiting strategies and find out methodologies of bypassing them. And the other thing we see people doing is around creating application level changes. So these could be forcing people to create accounts and limiting what those accounts can do. We see this having limited success in that it does quite often lead to just a fake account creation that we mentioned earlier, or even worse, legitimate accounts being compromised and misused. The other thing that people do is putting things like capture validation on searches to try and bypass, force non-human traffic to not be able to do that. The issue around that is that the more sophisticated bots can bypass some of the capture systems, so you need to make sure you're using the right capture system. And from a human traffic point of view, it does slow down the process, and humans are not that keen on it. It can lead to users being unhappy with the usability of your system. And the last one, which I think is probably what we'd recommend doing, is looking at more proactive traffic analysis, really looking beyond requests to look at the nature and the pattern of requests that are being made, and then use some intelligent algorithms to analyze that patterns to determine the activities of the traffic that you're seeing and what they're actually up to. Once you've done that, you can come up with a more adaptive management methodology based on what you've learned. It can be a combination of some of the management things. It can be a combination of caching. It could be redirecting certain users to different content sources, returning content in a different format. There's various things that you could do around that. This kind of learning you can also then start putting, rather than capture, you can start embedding honeypot traps, which are bits of functionality that should be invisible to legitimate human users, but make it more difficult for bot traffic to stay on top of getting through your site. Okay, so I think in summary, we've got, I think just cover it off quickly. This is a problem in the retail sector. There is a wide variety of bot traffic that's out there. There's a number of different challenges, not only price scraping, that you've got like sneaker bots, you've got account takeover. There's some of which is acting for good, so there's good and bad traffic. There isn't a simple solution to the problem. You've got to know which is good and which is bad, and then you've got to do the proactive analysis to determine what the impact and value to those are, and then come up with a more nuanced way of managing it. So in summary, I would say analyze your traffic and determine what you need to achieve from it. So hand back over to Tom now.
Yeah, sure. So there's a really interesting couple of bits here. So we are going to move to a Q&A. We've got a couple of questions that we're going to tackle. If anyone does have any more, please submit them, but we're going to be working through them very shortly. I think it's important just to note, if anyone does want any help, if they suspect they have a bot issue, we're more than happy to, work with you, show you that the type of insight we're showing you. If you're interested in sort of seeing, do you have a bot problem? How much of your traffic is non-human? And you want to get that level of data, such as that Andy's shown you. We can definitely cover that off with you. So, if anyone's interested, please do get in touch. Any questions, do submit them. We've got a few to work our way through. Bang on time as well, so we expect to finish a little bit early, but it depends on how many questions you guys throw at us. And so without further ado, we'll just move to the question section. First question, would you recommend ticking the bot filtering option in Google Analytics? Do you know how accurate it is? It says it excludes all hits from known bots and spiders. I think that's a really interesting question. Andy, do you have any take on that?
Yes, and I think it's one of those things of, yes, it won't do any harm. I wouldn't vouch for how accurate it is. The issue you've got when you talk about excluding all known bots and spiders, you're only excluding one that it is known to Google, but also ones that accurately identify themselves as bots or spiders. You won't get the kind of less legitimate bot traffic that's out there. When we're talking about things like competitor price scrapers, they would definitely hide their identity, and some of the less legitimate price scraping, price comparison sites also hide their identity as well, so that they're not picked up by things like this. But so it won't get the full story, but it's certainly something that's worth doing in Google. It will make your stats, your Google stats, more accurate than they are without doing it. But I would say that it's not the full story on accuracy around that.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, Greg. I've worked with quite a few people on this sort of exact thing, and what I quite often find is that the marketing team stats will be very different to the infrastructure team stats at the other end. Of course, Google will require a bot to trigger JavaScript. A lot of them won't, so they will bypass it. So that's great because your analytics won't see that, but it's still potentially hitting the IT team. We also see marketing people, tend to be really on it in terms of what traffic's hitting them. So we quite often go into organizations where they have a really long list of filtered out IP addresses, geolocations, and all sorts of stuff that's filtered out from the Google Analytics. But quite often for a lot of organizations, that's the only view of traffic they have. So it's great that those Google Analytics are getting better, and it's great that you're on top of your analytics, but quite often all that traffic can still be hitting the back-end infrastructure and having an impact on what's going on. And if anything, it's kind of decreasing the visibility unless you've got another sort of way to do that at the back end, which some companies do. So really interesting question. I think in short, definitely flick that button and switch it on. It's going to make things better for you. I think just do be aware that it will then be hiding the problem, and potentially there could still be an impact on the infrastructure at the back end. I think the next question we've had come in from Susie, is there any kind of, we use DDoS, will that help mitigate against some of the bots that we've mentioned?
I think it's one of the, DDoS does a certain job, and it is about blocking a type of automated traffic, and it does that job successfully. Now, the type of automated traffic that it's designed to block is not typically the same as what we're talking about here as non-human traffic. It is much more high load with a specific objective in mind of preventing service from your system. The sort of non-human traffic we're talking here generally operates at a lower level than that, and unlike DDoS, which is requests that are made in a certain way designed to make your server struggle, the non-human traffic is legitimate requests designed to get data back in the same way as a human would. So unlike DDoS, which has a objective of trying to bring your system down, this traffic that we're talking about today does not have that objective. It has the objective of getting your system to operate in the way that it is intended to, and the data that it gets returned, or the activities that get returned, it expects those to operate correctly. So DDoS systems won't particularly block this. Similarly, when we talk about WAFs, web application firewalls, it's a similar kind of story. A lot of people try and use WAFs to mitigate this. But again, WAFs are about detecting unorthodox or non-standard requests made to your system, whereas these requests are legitimate requests, the same as would be made by a human. It's just what they're trying to do with the data that they get back, which is different. So you can certainly block certain types of attack by putting blacklists and things like that within those kind of tools, but ultimately it's not what those tools are for. So you do need a more specialist tool in order to successfully identify this kind of traffic.
Another interesting question from Steve. He does think he has a bot problem, but he doesn't think it will be price scraping due to the nature of the business. Yeah, what other types of bots I think would be interesting in this space? I know I've certainly seen a few. Are there any particular bots that spring to mind for you, Andy?
In the retail space, I think the account takeover, one which we've talked about today, that seems to be increasingly common in this industry as accounts become more common. Certainly benefits or save details against accounts and things like that. There's more to exploit. I think the kind of automated purchase bots, I think, are an interesting one that's on the rise for any company that has a very specific range of products. So that's the kind of what we might call sniping bots of trying to take advantage of your system. I think they're the main ones.
Yeah, I think from some analysis we've done other things that we would see. Quite often we've seen a lot of noise from vulnerability scanning, and quite often not necessarily your security partners. So vulnerability scanning bots out there, which potentially could be a malicious hacker or just a vulnerability scanning sales company trying to build their sort of database out. We've seen some of that in the retail space. I guess the other piece as well would be around SEO. So still scraping, but not necessarily price scraping. They're looking to steal your content, your imagery. If you're selling a product that other people can sell, and they can just rip off your descriptions, look at your keywords, screaming frog, SEO bots, things like that. We do see a lot of people using those SEO tools to effectively scrape people's sites, mine their sort of keywords, and then use that for their own purposes.
Yeah, I think the extension from that is actual legitimate search engines as well, which is obviously a form of scraping, but we do sometimes see search engines who are very aggressive in how they're spidering sites. So we can see massive amounts of data and massive amounts of overhead being taken up by search engines. And they may be search engines, so, Yandex, for example, maybe within a market that you don't operate in. So it's not something that you'd be interested in having. You can sometimes see negative effects by over-aggressive spidering policies from search engines.
Yep, and final question, this is for Dave. Is there any typical symptoms that people can look out for in terms of identifying bot traffic or noticing on their sites?
Yeah, and I think it's not really a sort of a nice easy answer, but it's almost anything that you would see as an unusual pattern of data or behaviour, and this can be you need to look at this from both a technical side, so looking at server logs and monitoring tools and things like that, and looking at what you would think is an unusual usage pattern, and also from a business point, looking at your business analytics to see if you're seeing unusual spikes in traffic versus conversions, or unusual amounts of usage of certain areas of your system, or just what you would think of as not what you would expect. I mean, you know your business and the standard way that it operates well enough to know that if you see something that doesn't look quite right, that may well be something worth investigating. There's not, as we say, there's not a kind of hard and fast answer, but it is about analysing all the data that you've got, and if things are looking sort of not what you'd expect or an unusual pattern of behaviour, then it's worth looking into that in a bit more detail to get some understanding of if it is non-human traffic, and if it is, what it's doing. Is it what you would want traffic to be doing? Is it for the benefit of your business?
Okay, great. And so we're going to wrap up there. There's a couple of questions we are going to take offline due to the fact they mentioned sort of specific products, that we'll talk about brand names, things like that in this section. So a couple of questions we want to take offline. We will get back to you via email straight after the session with a pretty detailed answer on those. Really interesting questions, so we'll respond back on them. I think, we've got the last few minutes. I'd just like to take this chance to thank everyone for joining us today. It's great to see so many retailers looking at what's going on the sites and the interest in this space. If there is anything we can do to help you and you do want to get that insight, do give us a shout. We'd be more than happy to show you how we can give you that kind of visibility over how much your traffic is non-human. But without further ado, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, and also thank you, Andy, for joining us today. It's been a really useful webinar. We hope you've all found it useful. Thanks a lot, and have a great week, everyone. Thank you. Bye.